We are getting to our first session, then you get a big fat break. And this is a perfectly timed session after Jen Daskell's talk because we are going to talk about modern terrorist threats to the United States. I don't have to tell you, you heard it, the terrorism threat is acute. The lights are blinking red. It is not a static threat. And to kick us off, we have these three amazing speakers. We've got Sam Hunter, an IO psychologist. He will tell us about the domestic landscape. Austin Doctor, a political scientist, will give us a window into the international landscape. And then, of course, we have Martha Crenshaw. Thank you, Martha. Martha flew in from Ireland and graciously took a call from me this weekend. She's also a political scientist, and she's going to map the connections for us. So each is going to take about 10 minutes, and then we want a robust Q&A. So, be thinking about what you want to ask these folks while we have them. With that, we'll get you started, Sam.
Thanks, everybody, for joining. We are incredibly grateful to have everyone here. I'm going to begin by thanking and acknowledging this amazing team I get a chance to work with every week. My co-PI on the project, Dr. Ligon, Drs. Bass, Dr. Neely, Dr. Parsons, soon to be Dr. Moeller, Lacey, and Carter Welch over there in the back. I also want to thank Ajmal specifically for all of his support on the project, as well as our friends at OUP. Whenever a project like this comes to fruition, there's a lot of coordinating and hoop jumping. We are incredibly grateful for all the things that it took to get started. And with that, let's get started. Spoken at length about the shooting in Buffalo, New York, so it's a good segue. This event occurred about 8.5 months on the heels of that event. So this individual walked into a grocery store, fired several rounds into the ceiling and into the self-checkout kiosks. Local PD were deployed very quickly. He did not comply with local PD and was killed on the scene, likely preventing another mass casualty event. I choose this case for a very specific reason. It happened just on the road from here. More specifically, this was about a mile away from my home at the grocery store my daughter and I get groceries at every Sunday morning because we like the blueberries there. The reason I'm highlighting that specific case is studying the DT threat and the DVE threat is inherently intimate. These are folks that come from our states, our communities, they're sometimes our neighbors. And there's this psychological reckoning, I'll sort of break character a little bit. There's this psychological reckoning that happens when you realize how intimate the threat is. That makes it hard to study, it makes it hard to talk about. But we have to, because the threat is very much on the rise. Director Wray, Secretary Mayorkas have talked at length about the increasing numbers with regard to the DVE threat. A recent independent GAO report suggested a 350% increase over 8 years, so this is through 2021. In parallel with that, there's been a lot of discussion around the lone actor threat, lone wolf threat, sometimes depending upon your language. In fact, there was some research out of my former institution suggesting that lone actors are both more frequent and more deadly in their attacks. While we acknowledge the importance of this research and think it has a lot of value, there's a bit of a rub here, which is we think it's a bit of an incomplete picture when we talk about the domestic violent extremism landscape. Instead, we are offering that what it means to belong to and participate in organizations has changed, and our models for terrorism and extremism need to adapt and be modernized to better capture what it means to belong to and participate in organizations. Fortunately, there has been some literature in the organizational psychology field over the last 20 or 30 years that we can lean on. It's empirically backed. There's a lot of good theory there, and that's what we've done over the last year or so. What are some of these things that I'm talking about? The nature of work has fundamentally changed. Gone are the days for a lot of Americans of the 9-to-5 job where you go in, put in your hours in the office or the factory or the shop. Instead, that's replaced with gig work. So by 2030, estimates are around 50% of the economy are going to be involved in some form of gig work. So if you don't know what that means, that's driving for Lyft on the weekends, working as a realtor during the week and picking up shifts at a diner when needed. You might be building a website for TaskRabbit, it might be walking dogs for the Rover app, might be selling things on eBay. All this is simply stating that the nature of work and our affiliation with those organizations is changing. So you're belonging to multiple organizations, you're ebbing and flowing between those organizations, and so those are very different dynamics than there was a generation ago. I can't imagine my grandfather seeing the world of work today, how he would respond to what it means to belong to an organization. In parallel with that, we're also seeing a decline with in-person participation across a bunch of other groups as well. So this includes things like decreases in the Boy Scouts, decreases in labor unions, decreases in the Masons Club and Elks Club, Lions Club, Rotary Club. Folks are going to church far less often from the 70s, about a 30% drop. We're talking to our neighbors less, by 20 points over the last 10 years or so. But we're social creatures. It's not that we don't connect or belong, we're simply shifting to how that's happening. So we're doing a lot of that online. We might not talk to our neighbors in person, but we're talking to them, sometimes about them, through social media. We are not necessarily playing Little League, but we're playing MLB 2025 on our PlayStations. We might not go to shopping malls like we did when I was a kid, but I can tell you that through my credit card statement, my daughter is definitely shopping online. Our lives are just becoming more digital. So in parallel, in some ways in relation to that as well, there are shifts in roles for men in our society. Men are going to college at about a 70% decrease relative to women at this stage. Estimates are by 2030, about a 2-to-1 ratio of women to men in university. For men that don't go to college and only have a high school education, employment opportunities are fairly low. When they are unemployed, they tend to stay unemployed. There's even a generational issue where if a son is born and their father is unemployed, the likelihood of that son being unemployed is significantly higher, even more so than our daughters. And so what we're seeing is an increase in loneliness, an increase in depression, an increase in suicide. There's an increasing pool of young men who are rudderless, who lack purpose, who lack a sense of identity, a lack of belonging. So they are then turning to online communities and organizations to gain that sense of belonging in a way that we don't want them to. So all of this is a bit of a sort of backdrop on the shifts in what it means to belong to an organization. But what does this ultimately mean when it comes to understanding the domestic violent extremism landscape? We offer a new perspective, which is called a managed ecosystem, thanks to Aaron Bass and all of her work on this. Uber is a good example of that, so we'll use that as an analogy and then apply that to the DVE landscape. If we were to take a drone and follow an Uber driver around, they would look like a lone actor. They would set their own hours, pick up who they want to, drop off who they want to, work in the areas that they want to. But make no mistake, they can't do that job unless there's a central organization that has structure and provides the infrastructure. And there is a central organization. So Uber has a beautiful headquarters. It's all glass. Look it up. It's gorgeous. They have a CEO, a CFO, a CIO. They have an accounting department. They have an HR group that's annoyed at everybody in the organization. They fight over parking and have holiday parties. They're a legit organization. But the central thesis of a managed ecosystem framework is that the locus of control is contained within the organization, but the locus of activity is outside of the organization. Nobody at Uber headquarters is picking you up from the airport. Everybody, in terms of a value proposition that is helping the organization, is occurring in many ways outside. And it's that synergistic and in some ways symbiotic relationship that helps us understand how Uber offers its value. Both of those things are necessary. This has an analog to the DVE landscape. We've got a number of organizations with command and control within that organization, yet much of the violent activity can occur outside of that organization. And so what we're doing is saying that these two are very much intertwined and interconnected with one another. And it's the, again, symbiotic relationship. And it's a more nuanced one. So we're not saying that there are members and non-members. We're acknowledging the sort of complexity and nuance from a managed ecosystem perspective. Why does this all matter? I'm going to say sort of main point twice, which is we solve the problems as they are framed. I'll say it again. We solve the problems as they are framed. If we continue to see membership as a dichotomy, that is, you're a member or a non-member, we begin to create participation blind spots So we start to miss the interconnected nature of many of these relationships. If we modernize, if we apply some of these emerging frameworks, and many of it is just our mental models changing about what it means to belong and participate in organizations. If we adapt, we have a much more complete, I think, and nuanced perspective about what it means to belong to an organization. With that, the hope is that we can create more effective interventions, we can create new and better ways of disrupting the DVE landscape. As the project moved forward, we've got a range of data that we'll be analyzing, testing a lot of these things out. I'm excited about what that next year brings for us, but this kind of puts forth our sort of footprint on what we're working on. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague in that order, who has amazing, wonderful things to talk about with regard to the FTO landscape as well.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Tech check. All right. Good morning, everyone. Sam, thanks for the intro. And Aaron, Grace. It's a privilege to join this group, to have the gang back together again, and to have a front row seat here to Martha and to Sam's insights. As a number of national security leaders have stated and testified recently, we know that the lights are blinking red. But I don't think that that's news to anyone in the room here today. I think we're looking at our news feeds, we're looking at our academic work, at intelligence reporting, and we can all see, I think clearly, that violent extremists of numerous kinds are willing and they are occasionally able to create harm and disruption and threaten the safety of America and Americans. I was asked to speak about the international terrorism landscape. I'm going to keep these initial comments really at 30,000 feet. I want to discuss some of the broad contours, some of the sources of change that we're seeing in this space, but I'm looking forward to drilling down a bit more in Q&A and just in conversations with you all over the next couple of days. But here's where we're headed in the next 10 minutes or so. To begin, I'd like to discuss what I think we're seeing across the international threat actor landscape, thinking about these groups, the constellations or networks that they belong to, and their related operational patterns. And I want to emphasize 3 segments of that FTO, foreign terrorist organization space in particular. That is the Iran-aligned axis of resistance, the Salafi jihadist ecosystem, and the global RIMV network, the racially and ethnically motivated violent extremist network. The bottom line here is that none of these are quietly minding their own business. Instead, there seems to be a simultaneous convergence of more brazen activity across the board. And then I think there are 2 really critical questions, simple questions, but critical to any kind of dynamic threat assessment, being the identification and the classification of the threats that are enduring. That is, the things that are staying the same, the threats that we know exist but still remain unresolved. And then secondly, what's changing? What are those threats that actually seem to be evolving in nature or form or emerging to the extent that they present new challenges that are materializing from up and over the horizon? I want to offer a few thoughts on that as well. Okay, to start with the Iran-aligned axis of resistance, I think putting it bluntly, it's been a big year for this network and its respective member organizations, most notably with the Hamas terrorist attacks on October 7th, reminding us how, a hard reminder of how faulty or overconfident assumptions regarding terrorist threats can serve as a foothold for strategic surprise, and also that the era of large-scale terrorist operations is not in the rearview mirror. Thinking more broadly about the network and this axis of resistance, while this network's operational posture, I think its strategic goals, its political priorities are largely constrained to the Middle East region. Hezbollah, the Houthi forces, militias in Iraq continue to be overt in their hostility to American forces, American persons, our partners, and local communities. Bottom line, the network is operating at a high tempo. It likely has additional latent capabilities in reserve. And I think more broadly as a cross-cutting lesson, we're seeing as a strategic approach that the axis of resistance is demonstrating how a joint high level of local political embeddedness backed with strong external state support can increase the vitality and the resilience of these local militant organizations. I'll also note that multiple groups within this network are driving some of the tactical innovation that we're seeing in the terrorist space, whether it be mass deployment of UAS, the deployment of sea drones, maritime unmanned systems, including incorporating paragliders in a complex combined arms operation, or the use of 3D video and propaganda design. These are all forms of innovation that are emerging out of this network and warrant continued attention. Looking to the Salafi jihadist ecosystem, and here in the subtext, right, or loudly, is the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. With regards to the Islamic State, we see an operational profile that I think is largely, it's a mixed story and one that's highly regionalized. Overall, and you can see this in the plot on the slide, right, we see a general sort of continued decrease in the total number of claimed attacks by the group, but at the same time, the network is increasingly focused on external operations, and it's doubling down, looking at the proportion of claimed attacks shown on the slide, doubling down on its investment in Africa. Since the turn of the year, I'll also mention we've seen, I think, a stubborn resilience of the group's cells active in Iraq and Syria. And just as a reminder, the group still maintains thousands of fighters active in the region who I think are still focused on and I think believe themselves to serve as a vanguard of resurgence, and this risk has not fully passed. On the Al-Qaeda side of the aisle, we've seen central leadership remaining relatively quiet, but its affiliates operating at a high tempo and with some success. We've seen a relaunch of the Inspire branded publication series meant to motivate and somewhat enable homegrown violent extremist attacks. We see the establishment in Somalia of a, quote, special operations training center in Somalia, and monikered after the Al-Qaeda's founding leader. And finally, watching central leadership make an overt call for like-minded jihadists to come join them in a relative safe haven of Afghanistan. It's also worth noting that Al-Qaeda's affiliates are the ones responsible for driving the surge of extremist violence that we are currently observing in Africa, and specifically in the Sahel and in the Horn. These groups and movements are increasingly embedded in local communities, increasing the complexity of resolving those material threats. Bottom line here, I think, is that the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda operate with distinct strategic blueprints, but both continue to present a sustained threat to the United States, its interests and assets abroad. And then finally is the Global RIMV Network. Recently we saw the new designation of the Nordic Resistance Movement, which I think is a significant and important advancement that reflects a lot of hard work from and behind the scenes of our colleagues at State CT. This group joins the Russian imperial movement as a designated threat actor from this strain of extremism. And I'll just note that I think that this network, we're watching it mature. It is using sophisticated technologies and tools to radicalize new individuals to their cause, and with a special concern of the targeting of juvenile and teen recruits into their movements. Sam's work, I think, on this segment of the DVE space in the US is on the very cutting edge of this research area, and I'm going to leave it to Martha maybe to elaborate a little bit more about how US-based RIMV actors are building stronger ties in these networks. And then with regards to enduring threats, what's staying the same? Where do we see a continued need for additional sense-making or evidence-based solutions? First is, I think, that Africa continues to lead as the global epicenter of terrorist violent activity, specifically within the Salafi jihadist space. Most operations, the most fatalities, and the greatest level of cross-border contagion. And I don't think this trend is looking to slow down anytime soon. Second, in terms of implications for U.S. homeland security from a FTO lens, homegrown violent extremism continues to be a prominent vector of violence, but I want to put a little two-finger caveat on this in just a moment. Third is Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State are continuing to show commitment from moving away from that front and center model of leadership we're just not seeing the same type of big marquee executives at the helm, but we're seeing top leaders acting as largely faceless actors, symbolic actors, but still generating influence and imbuing legitimacy from the shadows. And I think there's important sense-making work to be done in this regard. Fourth is continuing to see more and more use cases of malign exploitation of emerging commercial technologies to support or conduct violent operations. It's been true for a few years now, but I think we need to watch this space as it's evolving, looking for the emergence of novel techniques and the evolution in how COTS, commercial off-the-shelf systems, are exploited. Okay, lastly, for this last piece of the sort of the more dynamic piece of the assessment is what's actually changing, what's shifting, what parts of the ground are actually shifting under our feet here. Some of these were mentioned by Deputy Assistant Daskal. Is first the uptick in terrorist external operations, specifically targeting the U.S. and Western nations. Second is a bolder and politically embedded axis of resistance that has enabled it to remain resilient to degradation and deterrence efforts. Third, and I think relatedly, we've been reminded in the past year of the importance of messaging as we continue to observe this battle of narratives around the violent activities and even the political agendas behind identified terrorist movements. And last is the growing internationalization of the RIMV terrorist network. This is not a substitution to the traditional threat profile. It is, I think, a lethal addition to it. So I'll wrap up just by saying that we are, I think, in a period of heightened threat. Insight is leading and investing in efforts to better understand how terrorists and violent extremists present these emerging threats to U.S. national and homeland security. Look forward to learning from the work of all of our presenters and researchers this week. Thanks.
This is the name of the project. My collaborator in this project is Caitlin Robinson, who was not able to be with us because of a competing conference, but she's at Rice University, and I represent Stanford as an emerita professor on this occasion. I want to just talk a little bit about the project, but the next thing I want to show you is our new website. It just went into production yesterday from a beta version, mappingmilitants.org. As most of you know, this is not geographical maps. It is more network diagrams combined with timelines of relationships among groups as they change over time. If you want to look at the website and send me an email if you find glitches, and I will go back to the developer yet again with, with suggested changes as we go forward. So here's an example of one of our sort of maps, which as you can see is a network diagram that lays out the relationships among different groups. This is using a Shiny program with R. And you can see that we stress these different types of relationships: alliances, affiliations, rivalries, splits, and mergers. And we try to show those on a visualization, a map visualization. This is one way of showing the networks. We also have a visualization that's more of a timeline or a family tree, which hopefully you'll find that under maps on the website. So with all of this and based on this kind of information, again, our focus is on the dynamics of organizational relationships and also the types of organizations, and agree completely with Sam that we have a very diffuse, very disaggregated, very volatile organizational structure, but because you don't see organization doesn't mean there's not organization, just like Uber. So, we had two lines of inquiry stemming from this, and the first one I want to talk about is transnational relationships, and I think Austin touched on that very briefly. We did a study trying to figure out to what extent domestic extremist groups are forging connections with groups abroad, and we did a fairly intense, detailed case-by-case study of this. And our conclusion is that at the moment, and we know that things change very, very rapidly, these ties are still very, very loose. They're very unlike the sorts of ties that we've found in other group networks such as Global ISIS or Global al-Qaeda. And let me add, sort of parenthetically, that if you look on our maps, quote unquote, we have a map of global al-Qaeda, all the affiliates of the al-Qaeda Central, and also global ISIS, all the groups that are linked to ISIS. If you want to see these groups, when they allied, when the group might have been ended or crushed, or what happened to the group, when there were splits, when there were mergers of groups, hopefully that's all depicted there. So in terms of the transnational relationships of U.S. domestic groups, we found that although social media is indeed extremely important, we all recognize this, still face-to-face contacts have proved reasonably important in the development of these sorts of positive relationships. We also found that it was more likely to be the REMV groups, that is, those that are racially and ethnically motivated, who are more likely to reach out to try to form connections. We found often that these connections are sort of outside the political realm. Mixed martial arts competitions are locations where there are connections, again, relatively innocuous on the surface, but this does attract these sorts of groups. Also, certain music concerts, again, innocuous, completely legal, by and large peaceful, but it's somewhere that they connect. Most of these connections are not driven from a central leadership of the group, but more by members who are encouraged, facilitated, otherwise reach out to make these sorts of connections. We found that since January the 6th, of course, there's been much more disarray. I would say fewer connections being forged because of the sort of disarray that these groups are in. However, as we all know, through the summer and into the fall, we're going to see changes, and after the election in November, my own view is that no matter who wins the election, that we're likely to see a strengthening of these groups, and we may see an intensification of these sorts of connections that they're trying to forge abroad. I think, as we've all noted, one key characteristic of the threat landscape is rapid change. We can say something is the case now, and if I was speaking to you next week, I might have to eat my words and come back to you and say, no, I've discovered that they're doing something entirely different. We also look, to a certain extent, at state connections to these groups. Is there foreign sponsorship of these groups? We found that the state that has most connections is, of course, Russia, but that these connections are still very, very indirect. They're more along the lines of let us say, creating a favorable landscape for the activities of these groups by promoting disinformation and misinformation. It's not something that you could pinpoint really very easily in order to prevent it or to stop it. Again, it's sort of paving the way for them rather than direct sorts of assistance that we might see, for example, in the Iranian axis of resistance networks where there's overt sort of support. So those were our findings as of about a year ago. The report is on the Insight website. You can all read it, but things are changing. I think we should probably produce an addendum to the report in short order. Second question, based on this sort of body of knowledge, is when do groups attack across borders? When do they decide to attack outside what we would regard as their home conflict, the government against which they appear to have the most grievances, the state in which they are located? And looking at this, we found that you might say, well, perhaps it's a fairly common phenomenon, but our research suggested that only about a third of groups, if that, actually reach across borders. And so then you ask, why do some and why not others? And skipping through a lot of possible explanations for this, I'll say that we found that having transnational alliances with foreign non-state actors increases the likelihood that groups will try to act outside the boundaries of their home conflict zone. I think when you think about it, this seems intuitively plausible. that they would. And it's not so much that they receive material assistance that reduces the cost of crossing borders, but sometimes it's ideological encouragement. I'll just give a small example since Austin mentioned this case, and that's Al-Shabaab. We did look closely at Al-Shabaab. And as you all know, Al-Shabaab signed on to the Al-Qaeda network. They were very eager to do so. And at the same time, their cross-border attacks preceded their formal allegiance with Al-Qaeda. And in a way, you could regard these attacks, which included Uganda, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Djibouti, as sort of trying to enhance their chances of being a major player in the Al-Qaeda network. We also found that the decision to join Al-Qaeda as well as to engage in transborder attacks was extremely controversial within the organization and led to various sorts of leadership clashes and splits within the organization. There's an interesting feature of it, the relationship between splits and mergers and then cross-border attacks. We also found, digging further into it, that outside state support is even more important than having an alliance with another non-state actor. Again, this makes sense. Having outside state support can certainly make it easier to attack outside the boundaries of one's own country. So the bad news is probably that when you see what formerly domestic groups start to form these positive relationships, and I stress that what we looked at were positive relationships, not necessarily rivalries, which also play a role in this. For example, Al-Shabaab, again, is a case. Their rivalry with ISIS in Somalia could have led to some of these efforts to move outside of the Somalia as a conflict zone. Al-Shabaab was especially interesting to us because if you argued that, well, sure, they're retaliating for foreign military intervention, this is a very common explanation for terrorism. There were so many foreign troops in Somalia, they had plenty of targets. They didn't need to go outside Somalia to have targets if that was their aim. Another possibility is that they simply want to kill civilians, and if you've got foreign military on your territory, that's not as sadly useful to you as going outside in order to be able to kill civilians of the targeted country. So I'm going to stop on that note because I think we want to leave plenty of time for questions, but both of those are sort of implications that you can draw from our relationship data, and I urge you to look at our new website, and again, send me any comments. We are happy to deal with them.
Thank you, Martha. And thank you, panel. We have time for questions. Camden and Ryan are walking around with microphones. That way I don't have to repeat the question. So please be thinking of questions you want to answer these three. We won't let them go until they answer your question. So they're on the hot seat. Meanwhile, I guess, Sam, I want to turn it first to you, thinking of the Uber driver example. It's a great example. But some Uber drivers also drive for Lyft. Yep. And some have other gig jobs too. Yep. Can you extend the metaphor and talk about how that may represent not one ideology but mixed ideologies?
You just answered the question, Erin.
Well.
No. Yeah, the metaphor works on a few levels. You never want to overwork a metaphor, but it seems to be a pretty good one. But the idea that folks are belonging to multiple entities, multiple organizations, I think works well in the TVE environment. I also think it shows the potential for intervention, and I'm being a little optimistic there, but to get an Uber driver to switch over to Lyft is a little easier than the taxi cab driver that was a formal affiliate in their organization for 20 years and went into the shop and everything. And so I think there are some opportunities to break folks off into more positive environments because those affiliations that are connected in that way have the potential to get cleaved off in a positive way. So yes, multiple organizational affiliations, but also I think some room for intervention as well if they're a bit more loosely affiliated.
Okay, and follow up, you're still on the hot seat, Sam. I'm thinking about how you laid out the Uber driver and gig economy. I'm thinking about the men issue. I'm thinking about my 18-year-old daughter and the college search we undergone. And part of what I was searching for her were what were the colleges or universities that had more of a 50-50 split with gender. She went to an all-girls school. The last thing she needed to do, in my opinion, was go to another one. And so what are you seeing, if any, yet solution on the horizon to things that aren't exactly going to be turned around? It may be the way it is.
Yeah, Richard Reeves has a very good book talking about some of these interventions. He talks about some very early childhood interventions and dealing with some of the issues around men. There's no silver bullets, and there seems to be worse news on the horizon rather than good news. I mean, make no mistake, for the men that are going to college, economic opportunities are great, and for that top third, nobody's criticizing or suggesting that there aren't amazing opportunities there. It's this increasing pool of aggrieved and rudderless and feeling lost collection of men that seems to be growing. But you're asking about the hope, Aaron, so I'm sorry, I don't mean to jump back into the problem. There is, I guess, hope on the education, early intervention side, where he makes a call, for example, to have greater focus on shifting educational approaches, more male teachers in kindergarten, for example, and interventions like that. So I recommend that book. It's great. He talks very candidly from both sides of political aisle about a very complex topic, and does so like a scientist, which is great.
Tell us the author name
Richard
again.
Reeves. It's called Of Boys and Men. He has a TED Talk that's also very good that summarizes the book.
Thank you. Martha, turning to you, thinking of mapping militants, thinking of connections, thinking of what happened on October 7th, how did that day maybe change how these relationships work with foreign terrorist organizations?
The impact of October the 7th, I think that I'll just note two things about it. One, I would only say that in this group, but I've been a little surprised that we've not seen an attempt at imitation. I thought we would see such an attempt fairly early on, nothing near as organized as the Hamas attack, but something along those lines, a mass casualty civilian attack. And we haven't, which perhaps shows how difficult it was to actually organize something that was so destructive and so damaging. But I think we have a very real concern that there will be some imitation down the pike. Now, the extent to which this has affected American domestic groups also, I think, is yet to be seen, but the clashes we're now having between pro-Israel and pro-Hamas protesters, as we know, often groups inclined to be violent sort of feed off of protest movements, and as protest movements sometimes become violent, it sort of lowers the threshold for others to use violence as well. So I'd say we still should be extremely watchful about this. The extent to which all this makes it more likely that we will see Iran urging its proxies to attack the U.S., I think also remains to be seen. I think that's a very real danger as well. In other words, just as I think Sam was noticing early on, we don't want to be complacent about the fact that there's not been a very dramatic attempt at emulation at this point, because we're seeing a great deal of sympathy for Hamas and sometimes even for the attack that's become reasonably widespread. And again, if we're dealing often with aggrieved individuals, it's hard to, as we all know, very hard to predict the effect it will have on them. But I think that we should be very watchful. I hate to be gloomy. I've always been accused of being very gloomy about the prospects for terrorism over many years, but I'm afraid that it's not over yet.
Okay, so on that note, Martha, you two are on the hot seat. Your gloomy meter. So you have this beautiful long career in this subject. It's a gloomy subject. I mean, we know that. But on your personal gloomy meter, where are we in gloominess? Are we a 1 and we're kind of sad, or are we like a 10 and we're in the fetal position?
Well, you sound like if I turn, am I on again? Sound like one of these surveys that I'm always getting. Would you rank on a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 100 the likelihood that X will happen as opposed to Y? And how certain are you of your judgment? Well, I'm not certain at all of my judgment, but I think the descriptions we had earlier today about the counterterrorism successes we've seen in the United States, I take heart at that. We certainly have had a major impact on Al-Qaeda and a pretty major impact on ISIS. Not without getting into the debate over decapitation as a counterterrorism strategy, the removal of leaders has had an impact on these groups. They're not really leaderless resistance. The leaders may be subtle, and when I think either Austin or Sam mentioned that the top leadership of these groups is no longer so visible, they're more behind the scenes, that's because they want to survive as a leader. They don't want to be knocked off. They're trying to keep their identities secret. So I'd say on balance, I'm sort of middling. I've lived through so many years when everybody thought the terrorism threat had gone away. And when we returned, and many actors in government quite happily, to the great power threats, which easier to deal with. Eve of 9/11, this was certainly the case. Then terrorism, some horrible, ghastly, tragic accident happens and our attention turns again, when we should be vigilant all the time and not wait for there to be a huge shock to the system. So that would be my prediction.
Thank you for that. And I should say for the record, you know, we want to be hopeful, but we don't want to be Pollyanna. And so to your point, you know, I'd rather have you tell it to me straight than, you know, make me feel good. So Austin, we get to you. And by the way, audience, come on. I mean, I can hold the room, but this, you're the professors here. You're the government experts. This is your chance to ask these people anything, and I'll put them on the spot. So really, please take advantage of this. This is why we're here. There's a question back there, so Camden's going to take it over to Charlie. And Austin, hang tight, because I got one for you, but we'll let, we got another one? Okay, thank you. Would you mind standing up, please?
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
Okay. For the audience, my name is Andrea. I come from San Diego State University, studied Master's in Homeland Security. So this question is directed more to Sam because he covered the topic. First question is, what is the difference between past generations and newer generations in terms of, because newer generations are experiencing depression, anxiety, and the sense of not belonging, how can past generations encourage newer to not have those feelings? Second question is, how can older generation encourage newer generations to maintain, to be sharp on their education and continue moving forward?
Yeah, I'll try to tackle the first one, just because I'm a psychologist, so I feel at least mildly more comfortable with that. I study leadership as a central part of my work, and so role modeling is a huge one. I think this is true for everyone. I don't mean to harp on the gender issue too much, but I'll say as men, we need to do a better job talking about the psychological challenges that we face and have very candid and open discussions with our students and our sons. And in those contexts where getting help, seeking help, knowing that help, and even being proactive about our mental health is a positive thing, are often not discussed. That's precisely where we need to have those conversations. And so role modeling of more senior generations and older generations to break that cycle of having those candid and difficult discussions. And then I'm sorry, can you ask the second part again? Yeah, so how do we, part of this again, coming back to why so many men are not going to universities. And so, you know, how do we break that cycle and encourage it? I'm a little gloomy on this because there's been a number of interventions. There was a great example out of Kalamazoo, Michigan, where they would offer free college to students. The women took full advantage of that and succeeded and thrived. The men just didn't. They really struggled and often bounced around at that university despite. So it wasn't a cost issue. It seemed to be something else. And so intervening earlier, I think, is important. Providing unique and special structure for students in universities that might struggle for a variety of reasons is also critical. And I think doing research around the topic, which is largely understudied at this stage, is useful and important. In the 1970s, we saw an inverse, so women weren't going to college at about the same rate that men were not, so it was about a 15-point difference in 1970. So they did Title IX and other initiatives that had a profound and critical and necessary impact on supporting women. In the 90s, it was about even. So we've now seen the inverse. And so I think there need to be some research programs aimed at understanding better why men are struggling at a university level, and so we can develop the right interventions there. We simply don't fully understand it.
Thank you for that, San Diego. Way to bring it. I'm going to find a prize for you. Oh, okay. We have a question right up here from a stranger. I don't know this person.
Hi, thanks, Ryan. Okay, so Austin, you talked about, my notes, I said that Africa is leading in terms of the Salafi jihadist sort of ecosystem. At the same time, we're hearing that the U.S. is pulling out of Africa. Can you talk a bit about those implications, if that's related, if what's going to happen, any ideas about the implications of that decision? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Gina. So short answer to that is I think, yeah, a lighter presence creates greater structural opportunity for continued cross-border contagion of the Salafi jihadist threat in particular. I am concerned also as a second-order effect in thinking about who will be filling that security apparatus space. Thinking of, for example, Russian-aligned paramilitary forces that have a track record of abuse, of actually perpetuating the structural problems that fuel the grievances, the pre-existing grievances of the groups that are active in the communities that live in different parts of the continent. And so, yeah, my view is, particularly as we're seeing the withdrawal from Niger, for example, that in the short and intermediate term, we're likely to see a greater problem set there with respect to violent extremism. It also may present new challenges by way of intelligence collection that makes rapid sense-making and proactive sense-making of that dynamic environment more challenging. And so that'll be something to monitor as well, as the counterterrorism workforce is still very mindful, obviously, of the problem set and the growing issue in Africa.
Thank you, Austin. I want to get to that question right there, Ryan. And do you mind standing up and saying who you are?
Sure. My name is Michael Becker. I'm at American University, and there's a question for Dr. Hunter. I was wondering if or to what extent you may differentiate between movements and organizations that are involved in political violence. I study the online space in particular, and while there's a lot of places where you see movement toward political violence or support thereof, it's not really the card-carrying members, and there really isn't as much of a strict hierarchy, even among people who organize or have these spaces.
So I would think just as there is room to have a more nuanced discussion about what constitutes organizational participation and engagement, we need to also think in a more gradiented way about organizations as well. And so, you know, putting movement on one side and organization on the other, acknowledging that there's a lot of nuance connecting those things. Historically, organizations involve, you know, more formal organizational structure, reward systems, recruitment, those kinds of policies and procedures that are in place. But in an online environment, those things may take more subtle forms. They may be more social in nature. And so I think, to your point, drawing a dichotomized perspective between those two things is also a bit of an injustice, and drawing a more of a continuum is probably helpful.
Very good. We got a question in the back there.
Hi, my name is Charlie. I'm a student here at Ensight, and I had maybe a similar question. It sounds like a common theme in a lot of your presentations talked about how the present circumstances of terrorism are changing, especially with contact between actors, where it might be faster. There's more online formats. People meet internationally. And if we're also seeing that in wider society, people don't belong to things as much, what is it that makes avenues to violence seem attractive if they're similarly short and kind of disconnected?
Who wants to take that one?
I'll take a first swing. It's a great, really cool question. Thanks. And then I'll leave it to Sam and Martha to correct what I've said. When I think about the structure of violent extremism domestically and worldwide, I think you're exactly right. We're seeing some level of decentralization, even within these organizations that have traditionally had some level of hierarchy and centralization to their structure. But what doesn't go away is the need and the role of influence, right? So what we're really, I think, asking here is, okay, how are thought leaders, action leaders still achieving influence over those who are like-minded or who are susceptible to joining their cause? And I think we're still seeing those instruments sort of in full swing, right? So whether it be online or in person, influence is being achieved. Now, the extent to which we see direct command and control, close and tight monitoring and enforcement of of orders and then action on those orders, I think that is changing. But the extent to which we see influence around motivating an attack, influence around the preferred methods and rationales behind an attack, I still think that that's very much part of today's violent extremist landscape at home and abroad.
Thank you for the question, Charlie, and for the answer. Did either of you want to?
See if I can. There we go. I would just add a couple of things because it's just a huge and complex subject that we've all addressed. And one is that one reason for decentralization and disaggregation is adaptation to the counterterrorism response. And so it does mean that influence has to be exerted in other ways, but that's true of all of political and social life now, so it's not unusual that it would be terrorism. And the question of the individual, when does the individual take it upon? Usually it is himself rather than herself to act, actually, as opposed to simply blogging or posting things on TikTok. That's really very, very difficult to ascertain. I know many studies, as I'm sure we all do, of why the individual, but one thing that stands out to me is that often these largely individual-inspired mass casualty attacks are themselves meant to inspire others, and that's an important aspect of the psychology of the perpetrator. It's not just that they're inspired themselves, they intend their action they even will say things like, the masses are going to rise up behind me. It's delusional, but that sort of mentality that wishes to spread the message and to create a great onslaught of attacks, I think, is an important aspect of it. But again, it remains a very large puzzle, I think, for all of us.
Thank you. Can we have a mic? Oh, you have a question, really? Okay, hold on just a second there. Would you please say your name and where you're from?
Hello, everyone. My name's Andrew Nolene. I'm a member of the San Carlos Apache Tribe of Arizona, and I'm a student at Haskell Indian Nations University. While you were speaking, I noticed that some of the key points that you made, such as isolation, emerging technologies, and transnational relationships, all seem very extremely relevant to tribal communities. So I was just wondering, in any of your careers, have you seen any efforts to build relationships with tribal governments and their communities? Or is that something that any of you have been interested in? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. That's great. We're glad to have you here, by the way.
I can jump into that first. First of all, thank you so much for that point. I can only speak as an academic, so my work has not focused on that area. What I know is that tribal relationships are a key priority of the DHS and interagency community. There are multiple lines of effort to support, foster, and build on those relationships, and I think there are many people in the room here who can actually follow up with you offline to talk a little bit more about what that looks like. But I think a really, really important question, and I'd love to follow up with you as well to talk about what this might mean for academic study, to thinking about those particular factors that you mentioned in terms of transnational relationships, isolation, and what that might mean for violent extremism.
Thank you for the question. We're going to have one last question. We get board member prerogative here. So thank you.
Much. Hi, Ruhana Hafiz. I have the Domestic Partnerships portfolio at the National Counterterrorism Center, NCTC. I'm thrilled to be here, so thanks for that. I was just going back to some of the notes I made during this wonderful panel. So I think, Austin, you talked about the malign exploitation of commercial technology. So that's not new, right? So TikTok is new-ish, but Facebook's been around too long. And you don't need a TS/SCI clearance to have an Instagram account. So my question is, how can the CT community bear down on the Nadellas and the Pichais and the Zuckerbergs to make them a better partner in this fight? Because every time I open New York Times or WAPO, it's, well, Zuckerberg failed our young people again. So that's not new, and you said it's almost the same. So where are we as a CT community not bearing down enough for this persistent problem? Thanks.
Sure, yeah, happy to jump in. And Sam is incredibly active in this space as well, and I think can offer some insight and wisdom. From my part, I can't speak to the public-private relationships and dialogues that you've had with a number of these key tech companies because I'm not in that room. What I think the role of academia and applied academics in particular can be to support those discussions is proactive, over the horizon sense-making of where the threat is going to be so that those conversations are held at a time when proactive measures rather than reactive measures are taken. As you said, I sort of categorize the malign exploitation of commercial tech under the enduring rather than emerging problem because as a theme, you're exactly right. This has been here for a minute at this time. The thing that turns that into an emerging threat, I think, is the evolution in how these different COTS, commercial systems in particular, may be exploited either in nature or in scale. And I think those are the things that we're looking at closely at Insight to support the more emerging threats discussions. In terms of getting it right, that conversation right, I think speaks to another issue I raised in terms of the importance of narratives and thinking about where are the points for common ground and collaboration in terms of interests between or within a public-private partnership. But would love to follow up with you more after.
Yeah, it's a great conversation. I'd love to be on that as well. I'll echo what Austin was saying. Certainly no silver bullets or quick solutions, but we think, and we've seen some success as an academic institution and as a center like this to be a bit of a third-party broker to talk to different institutions. Sometimes they're more likely to pick up the phone because they don't necessarily see us as a government entity. They see us as academics, which we are. And so sometimes those conversations can be facilitated in that way, and we do see that as part of our role as a center. And just pivoting a little bit, another role as a center is to Austin's point, look over the horizon. Think about how technology is both evolving and emerging, which we're able to do because we have access to some of the great thinkers in terms of the tech space, and then ask ourselves what malign actors may do with that technology. And in asking that question, we tend to get at least a little bit ahead theoretically and conceptually. So when we have some of those conversations with folks in the tech space, we can say, hey, are you preventing this or taking care of this? And hopefully we identify and stop the problems before they happen, because putting the genie back in the bottle once they're making money on something is much harder. So it's not perfect, but I do think we have a role to play as an academic center and institution there.
Very good. Let's thank our panel for their hard work today.